What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member or a relative? Story 1. A member of my family, Richard Stain, used to own the Motley Chavin pub in Motley, Yorkshire, United Kingdom. They fell on hard times, and in a drunken stupor, Uncle Richard decided it would be a good idea to set a fire and claim the insurance money. His plan was to wait until my aunt took the dog for a walk across the moors one evening, then start the fire while the flat above the pub was empty. But the night grew later and there was no sign of my aunt or the dog. He assumed they had gone out as usual, so he went ahead and lit the fire upstairs in the flat. They hadn't gone out. When the fire brigade finished putting out the blaze, they found my aunt and the dog both had died from smoke inhalation. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I had some family move to Vegas with a local church's money, close to $1 million, to open a new church for them in Sin City. They gambled it all away. Then when they came back, the church told them to freak off basically. They started their own church that allowed them to buy multi-million-dollar houses, brand new cars for them and their kids, basically a luxury lifestyle. They sell merch at the front door to the church. Members are required to provide bank info, and they tithe 10% monthly income from all families. If you don't pay up, they kick you out. They tell you how to eat and exercise. If you don't follow, they kick you out. They put it in an old movie theater, so they have multiple stages, full lighting and AV crews. They do love offerings when they need extra cash. God tells them to take trips, like told their congregation. God told them to ride motorcycles through the Grand Canyon. He even claimed he had healing powers for a short amount of time and got Saint tattooed down his arm. The whole 9 yards. At the beginning of the pandemic, when they were shutting everything down, they pressured their congregation to pay the 10% for the whole year up front. They've cut contact with all our family because we won't be part of their church. Also, their church is well known in our city and local area, but no one has stepped in because, Bible Belt. My cousin started a cult. Story 3. A few years before he passed, my dad and I had a long heart-to-heart, at the end of which, he told me he wasn't the one to first sleep with my mom on their honeymoon. He caught her in bed with her cousin, with whom she had been in love for a long time. He spoke with their pastor, who told him to forgive and forget. That worked, until 6 years later when he caught her again with the same cousin. He told me he wanted to leave with me but ultimately decided to stay because he wanted me to have a family. With all that happened in my childhood, and to him, workaholic, diabetes, heart attack, I wish he'd left and be happy instead. Story 4. For context, my dad is the second youngest of 15 children. His oldest sister has a son around the same age as him. We'll call him Vince. Vince and my dad grew up together and always got along well. He was even one of my dad's groomsmen. But a few years after the wedding, Vince became very openly religious. He started trying to get family members to come to church with him. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, until we noticed a pattern. He'd switch churches every month or so. Fast forward to when I was 1 year old. There was a family get-together, and Vince showed up with his girlfriend. They immediately started making everyone uncomfortable, not with casual religious conversation, but by telling people they were going to hell for drinking alcohol. Vince announced that he was becoming a preacher and told everyone they needed to attend his services or risk damnation. According to my mom, I was really sick at the time, and she had taken me to another room during the gathering to give me some quiet and hopefully calm me down. While she was there, she overheard Vince and his girlfriend talking in the next room. They were discussing which family members they could single out and potentially manipulate into going along with them. Then she heard Vince mention my dad by name. He said my dad would be easy to convince and that his job could probably fund whatever they were planning. My mom freaked out and immediately went to get my dad. She told him what she heard, and he didn't waste time. He confronted Vince right there. A huge argument broke out. Vince started yelling that everyone was going to hell, that they were all Satan's followers, and stormed out with his girlfriend. After they left, the rest of the family started talking, piecing things together. That's when the truth came out. Vince's sister had kicked him out for mooching off her, refusing to get a job, and stealing from her purse. Another aunt of mine had to do the same, for the exact same reasons. It became clear to everyone that Vince wasn't a misunderstood zealot. He was a manipulative scam artist, using religion as a way to live off others and try to control them. Fast forward to the late 1980s. By then, most of the family hadn't heard much from Vince in a while. There was a huge family get-together being planned, but two of my aunts and a few cousins refused to attend because Vince wasn't welcome. They claimed Vince was the Lion of God and said the rest of us were wrong to reject him. Another fight broke out over it, and those relatives never showed up. Then in the mid-1990s, my grandma passed away. One of the two aunts came to the funeral. The other had died a few years earlier, and she brought Vince with her. He had been explicitly told that he could come pay his respects, but that he needed to behave. What stood out the most was how my aunt acted around him. When Vince wasn't nearby, she was warm and talkative, but the moment he was around, she became timid and quiet, like she was repressing something. It was unsettling. My parents didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, curiosity got the best of me. I started digging online, and what I found floored me. Vince had become the leader of a religious cult. He'd pulled in both of my aunts, around 7 of my cousins, and anywhere between 30 to 40 other people over the years. The pattern was always the same. Members were required to give up all their belongings and money to serve God. He especially targeted immigrants, people who had come over alone and didn't have a support system. He bought a piece of farmland, and his so-called disciples lived and worked there. They grew crops, made goods, and Vince sold everything they produced, keeping the profits for himself. And he's still active to this day. There are multiple websites created by former members who escaped, detailing the abuse, manipulation, and control they endured under him. Story 5. My maternal grandfather, luckily he's now dead, was a big-time PDF file and S offender. All the girls on his side of the family, including his daughter, my mother, from as early as she can remember, until her early teen years. My mom told her mother about the abuse as soon as she could articulate it. Rather than doing anything about it, my grandmother started sending my mother into her dad's room to wake him up every morning because my grandmother didn't like banging him anymore and saw this as an opportunity to pass the buck. When my mom became a teenager, she moved in with her great-grandparents to escape the SA. Eventually, her parents divorced. My grandmother remarried and wanted to fix her relationship with my mom. She told my mom she was abused by her husband as well. She made it seem like she had no control over the situation and apologized for what my mother went through, promising it would never happen again to anyone else. Fast forward about 10 years, my mom gets married and has 2 daughters of her own. She's rebuilt a relationship with my grandmother and feels like the past is behind her. My mom let my sister and I sleep over at my grandmother's once. I was probably 7, my sister was 4, because she believed that her mother had changed. Rather than letting my sister and I sleep together, my grandmother took my sister to sleep in the spare room and made me sleep in the bed with her new husband. Turns out, my grandmother didn't like doing it with this husband either, and she had a new victim to offer up instead. Luckily, he wasn't a PDF file. That's the nicest thing I can say about him, though. He was a racist, homophobic piece of crap and is also now dead. But I did find it weird that I had to sleep in the same bed as him, and I complained to my mom the next day that his snoring kept me awake. My mother was livid. She called my grandmother, screamed at her for putting me in a dangerous situation, and we didn't see her for a long time after that. When we did get back in contact, we weren't ever left with my grandmother or her husband unattended. Eventually, my grandmother just kept trying to cross my mom's boundaries and we cut contact with her altogether. She reaches out to my mom every few years, but my mom just ignores her. Too much damage has been done. Story 6. My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart, so his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as slaves, picking cotton about 400 miles away. Apparently, this was not an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and 2 of his siblings were taken. Henry, who was now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later and found his mother hysterical about the kidnapping of 3 of her children. Being the man of the house. At age 18, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters, one on each hip, and set out to get his 3 siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk, who also had children stolen. He headed east, to where he was pretty certain the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars, and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through talking to locals along the way, who heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed down to a few cotton farms where he thought the kids were. My dad, who was 9 years old at the time this happened to him, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months, and had given up ever seeing home or the rest of their family again. They were kept locked in a barn, fed scraps, and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day, working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw my Uncle Henry walking towards them, and they started running toward him, when one of their captors rode up on a horse and started yelling. Henry pulled one of his guns and shot the man dead. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a gun, and it didn't matter. The gunshot drew a couple more of the rancher/captors over, and Henry off them both as well. My dad ran up and hugged my uncle, and he told them, "Let's go home." My dad tells me they rode on and in train boxcars all the way back west to their little Texas town, along with a couple other kids that were stolen from the town. When they got back to their small farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. He said Henry put the 6 guns away and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation about what had happened, that my uncle murdered 3 men to get his siblings back. It was basically still the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys eventually all joined the Army and Navy, and all served and survived World War II. My dad didn't tell me this story until after Henry had died. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken, diminutive, about 5'4", maybe 100-pound man who went on to own a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the feats of heroics he performed at age 18 to bring his family back together. Story 7. My great-uncle is a offender that prefers underage family members. I don't know how many people actually know, but my grandparents certainly do, along with his victims, my mom, aunt, and I know at least a few of their cousins, but I am not sure which. But then he found Jesus again, so we all have to forgive him and pretend nothing happened? It was before I was born, but that's the basic runaround I've gotten from my grandparents. They don't ever actually acknowledge it, just that Tony did bad things, but he found God. I eventually put 2 and 2 together about my mom's history or essay and her making sure that my female cousins and I were never left alone with him. And now that I am in my 20s, that duty has been passed down to me at every family gathering. It's like an unspoken rule that you can say why, just the warning, don't leave your daughters alone with him. I am tired of it though. Tired of shooing little girls away and having to pretend like it's normal, scoping toddlers out of a predator's arms and acting like everything's fine, and I am just baby crazy. When this is all over, I am not going to stay quiet anymore. The next time I have to be around him, I am taking children right back to their parents with the full freaking story of why it's dangerous. I am tired of having to protect an offender to keep peace. Story 8. My biological grandfather threatened to off my grandmother while she was very young and pregnant with my uncle. Long story short, he was engaged to someone else. My grandmother became a nervous wreck while pregnant and wouldn't leave the house, and he used to throw bricks through the window. Eventually she told some of her friends about what he'd threatened to do to her. Shortly after that he went missing, never to be seen or heard from again. We always kind of laughed and joked that one of her friends must have threatened him, or ran him out of town. We would even go as far to say someone might have offed him for her. It wasn't until we were going through her boxes of photos and love letters we realized she was actually friends with the Ray twins. Story 9. My uncle told a story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up really early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up in his direction. He asked him what the hell was he doing, His brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Both of them are mom's brothers. The wannabe Cain was a narcissist of the not letting a silly thing like being married get in the way of his dating life. Variety, who decided he had big dreams and bailed on the family and his wife when I was a kid and proceeded to overdose. Thus, I usually don't think of him as my uncle because I didn't have a real relationship with him. Not sure why he didn't shoot. My uncle might have wanted it to look more like an accident, or didn't want to look his brother in the eye. For those saying it's just a story, yeah, I can prove it, since there were only 2 people there, and one of them is dead now, of the aforementioned overdose. But the way that my uncle described it, he was really afraid of his brother, and thought he was capable of fratricide. Story 10. My grandfather, who I never met, was in a cult. He and his friends essayed my father and uncles. The weird thing is, my father gave me his first name for my middle name. I've always thought it was the Stockholm Syndrome that made my father name me after his pervert and demented dad. I am legally changing my name on my next birthday. My father has never been a normal person. Supposedly, according to my uncle, he got the worst of the abuse, which I credit to his messed up childhood. Story 11. My paternal grandfather essayed all his female grandchildren except for my sister and me. I didn't find out until I was in my late 40s when one of my cousins opened up to me. Nobody talked about such things in the Deep South in the 70s and 80s. Granny had no clue what was happening. Papa had a workshop in the basement that Granny wasn't allowed to enter. My dad might have had an idea that something was wrong, but I will never know. He passed away before us girls started talking. The reason why my sister and I weren't hurt was because we moved away when I was about 10 years old. As for Papa, he was a pillar of the community, a Southern Baptist minister. Nobody would have believed him capable of being serial offender. I am going to vomit now. Story 12. I am the only child between my mom and dad, but they both had children from previous relationships. All of my siblings were 15+ years older than me. When I was 7, my mom and dad split because my dad had feelings for my mom's oldest daughter who already had 4 kids. Okay, gross and crappy, but both were adults, so whatever. Cut to 13 years or so later, and my dad is suddenly all involved in the life of one of the kids of that sister. 20-year me was oblivious as to why this was happening. It took me another 7 years to put all the pieces together that my dad was the father of that kid. I had grown up thinking she was just a niece, but she was in reality my half-sister niece. I've never discussed it with anyone in my family. My mom died before I put all the pieces together. But wait, there's more. My family and I are all from Mississippi. Cue Deliverance banjo music. My dad was born in 1945, so unsurprisingly, he's super racist. And I mean like, super racist. That sister niece of mine? She ended up having 2 kids with a one-legged black man. The one-legged part isn't really relevant, except for him showing up to my house one day, and suddenly doing push-ups in my living room, for no apparent reason. Anyway, karma's a mean. Cheat on my mom with your stepdaughter. Get her knocked up, basically have nothing to do with said child's life. Then the child goes and commits, in his eyes, probably the biggest betrayal possible. I would throw a chef's kiss right here, except all I really care about from this story is the pain it must have put my mom through, and I was too young or oblivious to be there for her. Miss you, Cotty. Story 13. I found out that my grandfather's first wife before my grandma died of botulism from eating some tomatoes she had canned at home. She could have been saved, but he refused to take her to the doctor because the botulism was her fault. He let her die to teach her a lesson. Story 14. My grandpa, who died back in 2017, was a very quiet man and didn't talk a lot. A few years before he died, my mom, his daughter, told me why. Apparently, when he was around 10 years old back in the late 30s or early 40s, a girl around his age lived across the street. One time they went out with his rifle to shoot at random things in the woods. On their way home there was a fence they had to get over to get home. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help his friend get over the fence since she was a girl. As she was going over, the rifle fell over and went off, offing the girl. After the cops got involved, he was found to not be at fault, but the girl's family stood out in the street at various times over the next 2 weeks, yelling offender at my grandpa's house. He eventually couldn't take it and ran away from home. In his teens, he met this guy named Rocky and befriended him. Rocky was supposedly in his early to mid-20s. Something happened where Rocky ended up passing away and my grandfather took his name. I had always wondered why my grandfather had a different last name than his brothers. Here is where it gets even weirder. My dad was adopted, and until recently, we didn't know anything about his biological family. Well, thanks to all the DNA tests that have become common, we ended up getting connected with his biological family, to include his dad, my dad's dad, who is still alive and in his late 80s. Talking to that part of the family, we have come to find out that my dad's biological dad has almost the same story as my mom's dad. He also had accidentally offed someone as a child, ran away from home and changed his identity. Story 15. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she gave up for adoption, 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, and she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was because my father married her, but that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I know, for 59 years he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out is because of all the DNA testing people now do. This discovery really impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister and younger brother. I like them, and I am glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery really messed with me for a bit. Edit. This happened in the mid-late 1950s. Rubbers weren't available to teenagers at the time. There was no banging, no abortion, only unwed mother homes. She went to one when she got pregnant with my older sister because she was only 16. I don't know how my mother managed her pregnancy with my brother. She would have been around 21 years old and probably made up some story about a dead husband or divorce or something with the help of her mother. I have never done DNA testing, but the half-siblings have, including the one I grew up with, whom I've always called my brother, not half-brother. I think they all did ancestry. The siblings found other relatives first and made their way to me eventually. I don't think I will ever do DNA testing. I am done with surprises. The other relatives were the ones who told me about the siblings. The story is even wackier because the relatives were my mother's half-sisters from the father she never met, that she never knew existed. They found me 8 years ago after extensive genealogy research. I also have a half-brother from my bio dad, whom I met for the first time right before COVID hit. I've known he existed since I was 19 but wasn't able to find him. He found me. Furthermore, I am 62 now. My adopted siblings were better off. Both my parents and my stepfather are dead. I don't believe my stepfather ever knew about the adopted babies. I think the only other person who knew was my grandmother. I am looking forward to reading all the comments and other stories. It helps me feel a little less weird about the whole situation. Story 16. My parents told us they were married in secret until they found out my mom was expecting, and then they told their families. It later came to light that they married on the day they found out my mom was pregnant and lied to their parents and us, but that wasn't the doozy. My father was an only child, and his parents absolutely idolized him. They were very strict Catholics and very strict with my dad, never allowing him to play sports because they feared losing him or whatnot. My paternal grandmother had like 5 miscarriages. Anyway, after my dad's parents passed, he was going through their documents, and he learned they had to get married too. Their wedding license was dated 2 months after the date he had always been told. I know it's not a very dark secret, just a very Catholic secret in a very Catholic family. Story 17. When I was a kid, we went to my grandma's house every Sunday, and all of my uncles and aunts would be there. One day, I noticed that one of my uncles didn't show up anymore. So I asked my family where he was. They told me that he wouldn't be able to visit anymore because he moved away. Years later, I found out that he say and offed 2 women and they locked him up. Story 18. My stepfather was cheating on my mother. Didn't find out because he was caught cheating. Found out because he and his mistress were drunk, got in a fight, and he punched her so hard that she fell over and died. Found out about the whole thing during the investigation, the trial, and the conviction. It was weird to have a lawyer want to call 12-year-old me to a stand to defend the character of a man I already had very little interaction and a fear of, and that was before the manslaughter charge. Story 19. My mother supposedly has a fraternal twin. My grandmother couldn't handle the thought of 2 kids, so she gave the male child away to someone she knew that was moving away. In a drug-induced rage, one night my grandmother screamed at my mom that she kept the wrong child. It was never mentioned before or after that moment. My mom was roughly 12 at the time. She asked my great-grandmother about it, and she knew the boy's name but not where they moved to or who he was living with. My mom actually had met him once, but didn't know who he actually was. My grandmother denies it ever happened, and my grandfather felt that surely they'd have had to tell me. I doubt they would have though. When she was pregnant with me, my mom asked my great-grandmother what my middle name should be. My middle name is actually his middle name. Story 20. I found out from my dad that one of my cousins isn't related to anyone in the family. My aunt and her mother used to work at a hospital maternity ward, and apparently a woman came in one day and gave birth to him and then left the next day without him. My aunt decided to adopt him, but a few months later the woman showed up again asking where he was. They both lied that he was given up and didn't have a clue where he was. They still haven't told my cousin anything. Story 21. My dad told me that, before my mom and dad broke up, he hadn't been happy with her for several years. My mother even had a miscarriage at one point, which destroyed both of them, but he couldn't leave her because he was afraid that she would hurt or even off herself. So, his only thought was to have a kid with her, so that motherly instinct would hopefully prevent her from offing herself. Story 22. My great-uncle was offed along with his wife. The person suspected of ending them was run down and got stuck in a swamp and offed himself in the head. The strange particulars: my uncle, his wife, and the offender were all deaf/mute. The offender was renting a room from them. This happened in the 40s and no one ever found the motive. A few years ago I took a DNA test and found that I had cousins who had descended from the offender's wife. Turns out my great-uncle was cheating. Story 23. I found out that my great-grandpa got away with offing a person. He thought that my great-grandma was cheating on him with her dentist, so he went into his office and offed him. He got away with it too, and they didn't find out that he did it until he told everybody before he died. Story 24. One of my aunts raised another aunt's baby as her own. My mom had 4 sisters and a brother, all of whom got married and had kids, so I have around 20 cousins. Unfortunately, 3 of my aunts got breast cancer in their 30s, all 3 recovered, but years later the youngest, Maria, got it again and got it worse. Maria needed a bone marrow transplant. All her sisters and children got tested, but no one matched. The family then revealed that Maria had had a teenage pregnancy. Her first child was actually my cousin John, who had been adopted and raised by my oldest aunt as her second child. None of the cousins knew about this, including John and his revealed to be adoptive siblings. John was asked to get tested and was a match, so he agreed to donate bone marrow to his birth mom, Maria. John was in his late 20s at the time and had very little contact with Maria over his life, so he's pretty cool. The transplant took place, but Maria eventually succumbed a year or so later. Story 25. Both of my mother's parents had affairs without the other's knowledge. My grandmother had Parkinson's, and in one of her confused states, she told my grandfather that she had an affair. Suffice to say, my grandfather was not happy and put her in a home. He then started talking to my mother, trying to figure out when it could have happened. He speculated that it happened around the same time he was having his affair, which was around 1966. My mother was shocked. She was born in 1967. So, my mother may or may not be related to the man she believed to be her father. Story 26. My step-grandfather had a completely hidden life in Australia before he met my grandmother. He had a family and kids in Australia, and faked his death by driving his car off a cliff then moving to America. His kids thought he was dead until my grandmother found out about them, and reached out years later. His son actually became a famous comedian over there, and from what I know has a joke he does at his shows about his father faking his death to disconnect from them. Story 27. Found out my birth father was still alive and living in California after being told for years he had died in the Navy before I was born. Fast forward a couple of years and a sister whom I was told had died at birth contacted me saying she had been adopted, put all the pieces together and found out that my grandparents, mother then 16 and uncle then 14, were stealing cars in Southern California and running them down to Tijuana. When the feds started snooping, the whole family ran for the border and made it as far as Central America, where my mother discovered she was pregnant with me. They then turned north and made it to Zapata, Texas, where I was born. She gave me the name of her last boyfriend and told me he died in the Navy. Less than a year after I was born, she gave birth to my half-sister and gave her up for adoption, telling the family she was stillborn. My mother was a pathological liar all her life, and I didn't find out until I joined the Navy at 17 and found my birth father was still alive. Also found out my grandmother was an S-worker, madam, and arsonist as well, but that is another story. Story 28. My dad has a brother who I've never met, and I didn't even know about his existence until a few years ago. I asked my parents why nobody from the family talks about him, and why they haven't invited him to us, but they said, just because. And then we had other relatives over at our house, and I heard them talking about him, and it turns out the guy is a criminal, and he spent almost all his life in prison, but the worst thing he did is that he was S.A. his own daughter, or at least he was accused with it, but my mother, and also the half of the extended family, believes till this day that his daughter just made it up for attention. Story 29. Since a lot of these are about offing and S.A., mine is a bit funny. We once found a family photo album in my wacky aunt's house. Start flipping through the plastic pages and boom, group banging photos. There had to be like 20-30 people in these photos. It was back in the 80s, I'd imagined, and everyone was so hairy and ugly. I guess Aunt Jan is part of a swinging community. Story 30. When I was growing up, my grandfather hated anything Russian. If there was any news about them, he turned off the television. If they played against any other team in hockey or so, he didn't watch it, even though he loved ice hockey, and it was a World Cup final. When I was a kid, I didn't understand why. To me, he was a retired carpenter and grandfather. When he passed away, my uncle told me everything. How he served as a foreign volunteer for Finland in the Winter War against the Soviet. My great-grandfather was from Finland. How his friends were taken as a POW and executed. He then went back to Finland for the continuation war, where he was wounded and almost died in the Battle of Ilomantsi, the last big battle. Story 31. I found this out about 2 weeks ago. In my teenage years, my grandmother started dating a rough guy, and for about 4 years we didn't see her anymore, unless we were picking her up from the hospital after he beat on her. I took it that we were disappointed in her decision to keep this guy in her life. After a recent visit from my mom, I found out that my grandmother's boyfriend was a large-scale drug dealer who routinely, and without consequence, beat people in public. The cops wouldn't pursue him, people who knew who he was wouldn't press charges. My mother and her sisters went to the county law enforcement, and when they learned the man's name and looked up who he was, they literally gasped that this individual was in their county mob and that they could not discuss him further without consequence. My dad worked for a major hotel and resort and had the head of security, a retired Secret Service agent, make some calls. 2 days later, an FBI agent showed up in the doorway of his office, flashed credentials, and asked why my dad was looking into this man. After a brief explanation of the story, the agent told my dad, "Let it go," and left. The man was in my family's life from 1993 to 1997, when he died of a heart attack. My grandmother died a few months later. We've speculated on everything from mobster to high-value witness protection program participant. I am 40 years old, and I still have no answers on this very dark chunk of my family's history. If anyone has any ideas of how/where to research this, I would love to know more. Story 32. My favorite aunt and uncle were together for 15 years. Though they never married, they lived in a trailer park, and growing up, they were always the most fun to be around. We baked cookies, painted together. Some of my best childhood memories were with them. One day, my uncle died in his sleep. I was around 10 years old. At the time, I was told he passed away due to complications from diabetes. I had seen him inject his stomach before, so it made sense to me. Fast forward about 6 years. By then, my aunt had moved in with my grandma and was diagnosed with lung cancer. I always knew she smoked a lot and drank beer pretty often, but that's when my mom told me the full truth. My aunt had been an addict, and so had my uncle. It turns out he most likely died of an overdose. Even knowing that, it never changed how I felt about her. I loved her so much. As her cancer worsened and eventually spread to her throat, she went through a brief remission, but when it returned, she gave up the fight. I miss her so freaking much. Story 33. My great-grandma was an unplanned baby, and her mom died in childbirth. Her dad couldn't stand to be around her, so she was sent to live with distant family members, and saw her siblings maybe once a year. They all got to stay with Dad. I guess it's not super criminal or anything, but it's heartbreaking. Story 34. When I was very young, my oldest cousin died at the age of 23. I really liked him because he would take me to this local lake, and we'd throw rocks and dead fish into the water. I remember not understanding what was going on other than watching everyone be sadder than I ever knew was possible at the time, but I wasn't told why. Years later, I found out he offed himself. Years after that, I found out what happened. My aunt found him in the shed with a note saying he was gay, and based on how he heard the family talk about homosexuals, he thought they'd never accept him. To this day, they hold opinions I would deem hateful towards others. So honestly, I am not sure if he was completely wrong. Today he would be in his 50s. Story 35. My great-uncle told his wife that their son died right after being born and gave him up to the state because he had Down syndrome. They had twins, a boy and a girl, and he somehow hid it from the whole family for about 40 years. It was only found out when the family lawyer was dying and contacted the sister to tell her she has a living brother who lives in a home run by the state. I guess he had helped my great-uncle with the whole thing and still felt terrible about it. Also, for some added context, my great-uncle was extremely wealthy. He could have easily paid for multiple caregivers to help his son, and it wouldn't have affected his life at all. Story 36. Not really dark, but sad. My brother Russell was 12 years older than me, and I cannot remember a day without playing with him. My earliest memories are of him and me at a park. We shared a room together, and I remember the fun we used to have late at night playing pillow forts and telling stories. I loved Russell, and still do. When I was 7, he died in a car accident. At his funeral, I found out that Russell was not my brother but someone my parents took in because he had a bad home life. It messed my head up trying to grasp this, but I am happy that my parents had the compassion to take care of him and treat him as their own, and that he was such a big part of my life. To this day, I still consider him my brother and miss him every day. I love you, Russell. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.